Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed the little intro montage, and welcome to another showcase. This time around we have the Schwarzschild by SMNK. If you don't know SMNK, maybe you know the Parallax. Same author. So SMNK went on to become a very proficient player. This is an earlier design though, so there are some mistakes. Let's get right into that. So the first thing, and because, I released my laser tutorial recently, if you've watched it, you're probably noticing right now what's wrong with it. No? Still haven't noticed? Well, the 0Q laser energy right now is not maxed, and it's not going up. And the reason for that is there are a couple of cavities on the lamps that have storage, but no pumps. Just a bit of an oops, but don't do that. If you're not sure how laser works, wink wink hint hint, I have laser tutorials. Anyway, moving on. So, little mishap with the lamps, it's not a big deal, but it's still a mistake nonetheless. Another thing is the front armor. This is a front sider, and this is something you never want to do with, well, pretty much anything, but especially a front sider, and that is placing your armor beams in the same direction as the incoming fire. Now, on a purely technical level, the amount of HP to get through the front is the same, but it's also not quite the same, because if you've got a high-powered single shot things, even though this is 8 meters thick, it only has to go through 2 beams to get inside, air quotes. Right now there's still a bit more armor, but basically if you put the same thickness of armor but you orient the beams in basically any other direction, you're gonna have to go through more beams to get into the juicy internals. And that's just better, right? I mean, it makes a smaller hole, right? But if your internals get damaged faster or easier, that's a bad thing pretty much all the time. So don't do that. Don't orient your armor in the same way that the incoming fire, in the same way that the fire will come from. A very small mistake, again, this is a fairly well-built design, is, well, I'm saying a mistake in this case, it's not entirely a mistake. EMP is very cryptic. I wouldn't expect most people to know this, but you actually don't necessarily want, that's a lot of adverbs, you actually don't want to deal a whole lot of EMP damage in one blast. And that's because in my experience, if you've got a lot of damage in one EMP jolt, the EMP tries not to be wasted, so if you have a lot of damage in that one jolt, it will often go for something like a heavy armor beam, for example. And if it hits a surge protector, a lot of that damage will be drained, and the extra damage gets reduced as well. That might have changed, but generally speaking, it's better to aim for just about as much as you need to destroy one surge protector per blast. And almost 9,000 is a lot more than you need. Small amounts of EMP are actually pretty decent these days, because they might be more prone to targeting smaller components just because they can deal all of their damage into that component, and so they will accept to target weaker things, well, because simply they won't waste damage if they hit those weaker things, even though there are heavy armor beams available. So generally speaking, you want to balance your EMP. Now, having very low damage EMP jolts has its own drawbacks, namely that most things that absorb EMP absorb it by a flat amount, which means that small jolts can't go through as much wood or as much stone or whatever to hit something fragile. So balance the EMP. This is a bit on the higher side than you generally want. Moving on, the detection on this thing is actually a bit lackluster. Now, this is a laser vehicle. Well, the vast majority of its firepower is coming from the laser, And lasers don't really need very much range detection, but they do need good bearing detection. Again, not a huge deal, but if we look at this, we have rangefinder, radar gimbal, rangefinder, radar gimbal, laser rangefinder, wireless snoopers, which are not ideal, and exactly one camera. Now, the coincidence rangefinders, like this thing, actually have good bearing detection, but pretty much everything else in this list, except the camera, is mostly for range detection. And again, you just don't need much range detection for lasers. As long as you can draw a line between you and the enemy, even if the enemy is further than you think, the laser is still gonna hit. It doesn't really matter how far they are. Yes, you'll lose more damage to fall off if they are further away than you thought, and for your AI, it's not necessarily ideal not to know exactly how far the enemy is, but generally speaking, bearing is more important in detection than range. And this thing just doesn't have that much of it. It's also a bit exposed, like right here on the nose. There's some better locations for it, like on the turrets and on the sides. It's just for something this big, I would have expected a bit more variety in detection and just better spots for it overall. And then finally, we have, I need to scroll my notes. Oh yes, the thrust on this thing. It just doesn't have a whole lot of backwards thrust. I'm not sure why. This is a front-sider, so unless you want it to ram the enemy, you need a decent amount of backwards thrust. In fact, oh, there it is. Right, it's got these CJEs, these backwards CJEs, and that's about all of the backwards thrust it has, by the way. Like one of those CJEs on each side. That makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And that's definitely not a negative, but this thing uses warping, which has changed. So if you somehow got your hands on that design, chances are that the warping is broken, or at least not as good as it was. It is just life with From the Depths. Now, things are a lot more stable these days, but back when this thing was sent to me, things were still changing a little bit. Anyway, moving on to the positives, this thing has a lot of things it's doing right. I'm going to scroll my notes again. And yeah, so its defenses. So aside from the little oops from the lambs, it's got a pretty powerful lambs. It's got a ton of very nice missile interceptors. Those are about as short as they get. They are very agile. You don't necessarily need the turning thrusters for interceptors, but it's still kind of nice because you don't need the precision from the fins either. So it's got a good amount of them, and it's got shields near the front, and it's got a pretty large amount of surge protectors for EMP. Right here, you can see them lower down in the front. I think it's got some more in the back here. So just for its cost, it's very well protected. That's a very good balance of defense. I like it. It's not gonna go down very easily, minus maybe the fact that it's a bit easier to penetrate than it should. But still, overall, really nicely defended. The redundancy is also pretty good. It's got a lot more engine power available to it than it really needs to stay up. A good amount of thrust, except maybe backwards. But overall, it's not gonna stop working very suddenly, unless you absolutely, I don't know, overwhelming damage, I guess. But the redundancy is really good. And finally, the damage it does is actually pretty good as well. Well, EMP missiles are always pretty scary. I mean, sometimes it'll just get sunk into heavy armor, but sometimes, you know, just taking out heavy armor with EMP is not the worst thing ever because it makes it easier for other things to deal damage. And in this case, the lasers, while the AP on it could be a bit higher, let's see if I can get the tooltip. There we go. 100 AP is not the highest you can get. It's enough to, you know, deal good damage through a maximum strength shield, or maybe some low strength smoke. A combination of shields and smoke or heavy smoke is going to reduce the damage quite a bit, but it's still a very scary thing to be fighting, basically. The noodles on these things are really long, so the damage loss at range is also very low. So overall, just very reliable unless the enemy is heavily protected against lasers. And let's just mention that this thing is a really good attempt at a Scarlet Dawn fan build, basically. And the fact that they have a design that went on to become an actual official Scarlet Dawn design just speaks for itself. There's a little things about the aesthetic that doesn't really match the Scarlet Dawn, but overall it looks very good. Not necessarily a big fan of whatever this is with the slopes. I think sometimes you should embrace the sharp angles like this thing's front. The front is nice, even though it's so flat. So, you know, you can have some angles. This is a bit messy for my liking, but overall, still a very, very good success. A very successful attempt, I should say. And yeah, just a beautiful design. Very strong, and maybe some mistakes that are more for, you know, intermediate and advanced players. SMNK went on to become a bit of a prodigy, I guess, for From the Depths. Not sure if they still play the game, but anyway, thank you for sending in the Schwarzschild. Very interesting build to look at. Some nice different types of mistakes. And yeah, just generally thank you for watching. That's going to be it for this one. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.